As federal officials move toward the next operating rules for Lake Powell and Lake Mead, the Bureau of Reclamation's post-2026 review has put one Arizona number into the open. Under a no-deal federal scenario, the state could face cuts as high as 77%. One signal would be unusual. Several signals together are harder to dismiss. The draft environmental impact statement is already in the record. The 7 basin states remain divided over how future shortages should be shared. Lake Powell and Lake Mead are still carrying long-term stress, and Arizona agriculture sits close to the first impact zone because some farm supplies delivered through the Central Arizona Project hold lower priority than cities and tribes. But that is not the most dangerous part. The headline is not only that Arizona could lose a huge share of its Colorado River water, the hidden number is priority. This is not just a water cut, this is a planting window failure. Water does not reach a farm as a political sentence. It arrives as timing. It has to be there before seed goes into the ground, before labor is scheduled, before pumps run, before a field becomes a crop instead of bare dirt. So the question is no longer simply how much water Arizona could lose. The question is what happens when reservoir math reaches the canal, the irrigation district, the farmer, the well, the loan, the grocery chain, and the desert city beyond the field. Like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from, because this map is not only showing a war, it is showing where system risk may appear first. At the federal level, the day did not look like a siren. It looked like a document. The Bureau of Reclamation had placed the future operating rules for Lake Powell and Lake Mead into formal review, and the public record now contained the thing Western water managers had been waiting for. Not a press conference, not a single emergency declaration, a draft environmental impact statement. That matters because the Colorado River is not managed by instinct. It is managed by rules, elevations, release schedules, legal priorities, forecasts, models, and agreements that decide how much water moves from one reservoir to the next before anyone sees it in a canal. The operating rules now being rewritten are not minor paperwork. They are the instructions for what happens after the current guidelines expire at the end of 2026. They decide how Lake Powell and Lake Mead will be operated when the river is low, when runoff is weak, when states disagree, and when the system has to choose between delivering water today and protecting the machinery that makes future delivery possible. In a control room, that is the first red light. Not because the draft itself means collapse. It does not. A draft is not a final rule. A federal review is not the same as a shutoff. But a draft becomes dangerous when it appears in a system already under stress, because it tells every user downstream that the old rulebook is nearing the end of its life. Then the second light turns on. According to the Bureau of Reclamation, Colorado River system storage was around 36% of capacity. That number is not a forecast. It is a condition. It means the 2 largest reservoirs in the United States are not sitting with the cushion they were built to provide. A reservoir is supposed to be time stored in water form. It captures wet years so dry years do not immediately become crises. It smooths the calendar. It turns mountain snow into summer deliveries. It gives farms, cities, tribes, power customers, and wildlife managers the ability to plan. But when storage falls far enough, the reservoir stops behaving like a cushion and starts behaving like a countdown. The third light comes from the mountains. Reclamation reported that Lake Powell's minimum probable inflow for the water year was forecast at 2.78 million acre-feet, only 29% of the historical average. That is not simply a dry number. That is the upper river failing to refill the savings account. The Colorado River does not begin in Arizona. It begins as snow and runoff in the Rocky Mountains and the upper basin. By the time people in Phoenix or Tucson talk about Colorado River water, that water has already passed through an entire chain of physical and legal filters. Snow has to accumulate. Spring warmth has to release it. Streams have to carry it. Reservoirs have to capture it. Dam operators have to release it. Canals have to move it. Contracts have to assign it. When one of those steps weakens, the whole chain tightens. On their own, these signals could be treated separately. A federal document could be treated as policy. A low reservoir number could be treated as drought. A weak inflow forecast could be treated as hydrology. A state negotiation could be treated as politics. Together, they describe one larger configuration. The river system is no longer only asking who has a right to water. It is asking what happens when the physical river cannot comfortably meet the legal river. That is the abnormal pattern. The Colorado River on paper is large. The Colorado River in storage is smaller. The Colorado River in a dry year is smaller still. And the Colorado River, available to the lowest priority users after the rules are applied, can become much smaller than the headline supply suggests. This is where Arizona enters the dashboard. Arizona is not simply one of 7 basin states. It is the state with a canal that physically moves Colorado River water uphill and inland into the places where much of modern Arizona grew. The Central Arizona Project is a 336-mile system. It lifts water from Lake Havasu and carries it across the desert toward the Phoenix and Tucson regions through aqueducts, pumping plants, tunnels, pipelines, and delivery structures. On a map, it looks like infrastructure. In a shortage, it becomes a ranking system. That is why the first emotional mistake is to imagine Arizona water as one bucket. It is not one bucket. It is layers: river water, groundwater, in-state surface water, reclaimed water, tribal entitlements, municipal supplies, agricultural pools, long-term contracts, short-term deals, higher priority supplies, lower priority supplies. The map shows blue lines. The system sees seniority. And when the Colorado River tightens, seniority matters. Cities do not sit in the same position as every farm. Tribes do not sit in the same position as every irrigation district. A water user with a firmer legal claim does not experience shortage the same way as a user whose supply was always more vulnerable. This is why farmland becomes the flashpoint. Not because farms are the only users, not because farms are the only source of pressure, not because cities are safe forever. Farmland becomes the flashpoint because lower priority agricultural water can be the first place where a river shortage becomes visible to the public. A city may see conservation messaging, rate planning, groundwater credits, banking strategies, and political negotiation long before a household tap changes. A farm sees the shortage as a planting decision. Can this field go in this year? Can this crop be carried through the summer? Can this irrigation district count on enough water to make delivery schedules meaningful? Can the grower risk seed, fertilizer, fuel, labor, and debt if the water calendar is uncertain? That is the day changing shape. In the morning, the story is a federal review. By midday, it is a reservoir graph. By afternoon, it is a canal system. By evening, it is a field that may not be planted. The official signal does not have to arrive as panic to be serious. Water systems often warn quietly. The language is administrative: draft environmental impact statement, public comment period, operational alternatives, minimum probable inflow, reservoir elevation, annual release volume, lower basin reductions, shortage sharing. Those phrases sound distant until they are translated. A draft environmental impact statement means the next rulebook is being written. A minimum probable inflow means the reservoir may not receive enough water to behave normally. A release reduction means less water moves downstream than users expected. A shortage allocation means the pain is not spread evenly. A low priority pool means someone loses first. And when that someone is an irrigation district, the system has entered the farm before most people in the city feel anything at all. This is why the dashboard must be read in order. The first screen is federal. The Bureau of Reclamation manages the big reservoir operations. It tracks Lake Powell and Lake Mead. It studies inflow and storage. It models alternatives for how much water should be released and under what conditions. It coordinates with states, tribes, agencies, districts, and users. When reclamation changes the operating conversation, it changes the risk calculation for everyone connected to the river. The second screen is hydrologic. A reservoir can only release what the system can afford to release. When the snowpack is weak, when runoff is poor, when heat arrives early, when evaporation and dry soils consume more water before it reaches the river, inflow drops. The reservoir does not care about political promises. It responds to water entering and water leaving. The third screen is legal. The Colorado River is governed by a century of compacts, laws, court decisions, treaties, contracts, guidelines, and shortage agreements. In wet years, that complexity can sit behind the scenes. In dry years, it moves to the front of the room. The question is no longer simply how much water exists. The question is who has the right to use it, when, and under what shortage tier. The fourth screen is physical infrastructure. Water for central and southern Arizona does not teleport from the river into a field or a subdivision. It has to be lifted and moved. The Central Arizona project uses pumping plants to push Colorado River water across long distances and elevation. That means water supply is tied to energy, maintenance, scheduling, storage, and delivery capacity. A shortage is not just a smaller number, it is a different operating condition for the machinery that moves the number. The fifth screen is human. A farmer cannot plant a spreadsheet. A city cannot pump a legal theory. A tribe cannot plan long-term development on uncertainty. A power manager cannot generate electricity from a reservoir elevation that drops below critical thresholds. A household may not know the river level, but it lives inside the decisions created by that level. This is the larger configuration: official review, low storage, weak inflow, unsettled state negotiations, canal dependence, priority-driven shortage, agricultural exposure, groundwater fallback. Those signals together are harder to dismiss, and the most important part is that none of them has to be dramatic by itself. That is how system risk often begins. It does not always start with one catastrophic break. Sometimes it starts when several margins shrink at the same time. The policy margin shrinks because the old rules are expiring. The reservoir margin shrinks because storage is low. The hydrologic margin shrinks because inflow is weak. The legal margin shrinks because states remain divided. The infrastructure margin shrinks because canals and pumps must operate inside tighter supply conditions. The farm margin shrinks because crops need water on a calendar, not whenever the legal process is finished. This is the shape of the day. A person looking only at the headline might see a fight between states. A person looking only at the reservoir might see drought. A person looking only at the farm might see fallowed land. But the operational picture shows something more precise. The Colorado River system is being forced to decide how to ration uncertainty. That is different from rationing water. Rationing water is already difficult. It asks who receives less. Rationing uncertainty is more corrosive. It asks who can still make decisions when they do not know what water will be available, what rules will apply, what reservoirs will do, what courts may say, and what the next season will bring. For a farm, uncertainty arrives early. It arrives before the seed order. It arrives before the equipment schedule. It arrives before the labor call. It arrives before the irrigation district knows exactly how much it can promise. It arrives before the family knows whether the field is an asset this year or a cost. That is why this story cannot be told as a simple map of dry places. The danger is not only the geography, it is the sequence. First, the snow is thin. Then, the inflow is weak. Then, the reservoir loses cushion. Then, the federal rulebook becomes urgent. Then, the states argue over shortage sharing. Then, the canal supply becomes conditional. Then, the irrigation district waits. Then, the farmer hesitates. Then, the planting window narrows. Then, a field that could have produced food, feed, income, and work becomes empty ground. This is not just a water cut. This is a planting window failure, and that failure does not remain on the farm. If enough land is fallowed, rural businesses feel it. Fuel suppliers feel it. Equipment shops feel it. Seed dealers feel it. Trucking routes feel it. Feed markets feel it. County budgets feel it. Groundwater systems feel it if wells are asked to replace surface water. Power demand feels it if pumps run deeper and longer. The field is not the edge of the system. It is one of the first screens where the system becomes visible. That is what makes this day unusual. It is not a single disaster day. It is a transition day. A day when the official record, the reservoir condition, the hydrologic forecast, the legal conflict, and the farm calendar begin pointing in the same direction. The old assumption was that the river could be managed through bad years because the reservoirs held time, but when storage is low, time is thinner. The old assumption was that shortage could be managed through temporary rules. But when the current rules approach expiration, temporary becomes structural. The old assumption was that cities, farms, tribes, and power systems could all plan around a shared river calendar. But when the calendar shifts, every plan starts to carry more risk. That is the part hidden inside the dashboard. The official documents do not shout. The reservoir graphs do not grieve. The canal does not explain itself. But together, they say the same thing. Arizona is not waiting for a future water crisis to begin. It is already inside the machinery that decides who absorbs the next shortage first. And the next clue is not the 77% number itself. It is what that number becomes when it moves through the priority ladder. The number that traveled fastest was not the reservoir elevation. It was not the inflow forecast. It was not the storage percentage. It was 77%. That is the kind of number that does not stay inside a federal planning document. It escapes. It becomes a headline. It moves through local news, water agencies, farm offices, city councils, kitchen tables, and comment sections. It is too large to sound administrative. It sounds like a door closing. But the first rule with a number this large is to slow it down. 77% does not mean Arizona has already lost 77% of its Colorado River water today. It does not mean every user in Arizona would lose the same share. It does not mean every faucet, every farm, every tribe, every city, and every business would be cut equally. It is not a final operating rule. According to recent reporting on the federal no-deal scenario, Arizona could face cuts as high as 77% if the basin states fail to reach agreement over future Colorado River operations. That is the headline number. It is sharp because it describes what could happen when the political system fails to produce a shared plan and the federal government has to decide how shortage is distributed. That distinction matters. A possible cut is not the same as a completed cut. A planning scenario is not the same as water already removed from a canal. A federal proposal is not the same as a farmer opening an irrigation gate and seeing nothing, but that does not make the number harmless. A number can be dangerous before it becomes final because it changes decisions before it changes deliveries. Banks hear it. Irrigation districts hear it. Farmers hear it. City planners hear it. Tribal governments hear it. Developers hear it. Food processors hear it. Power managers hear it. Uncertainty becomes its own shortage. The number is not just water being removed, it is a season being pulled out of position. To understand why, start with the unit behind the headline. The Colorado River is often measured in acre-feet. 1 acre-foot is the amount of water needed to cover 1 acre of land, 1 foot deep. In household terms, water agencies often describe 1 acre-foot as roughly enough water for 2 to 3 average households for a year, depending on location, climate, landscaping, efficiency, and use. But on a farm, an acre-foot does not feel like a household comparison. It feels like a schedule. It is water that must arrive at the right time, not after the crop has failed, not after the seed order has been cancelled, not after the irrigation district has already told growers to reduce acreage, not after a lender has already tightened the terms of a loan. For a farm, water is not only volume, it is timing, certainty, and permission to begin. That is why 77% lands differently in agriculture than it does in a city water conversation. A city can sometimes stretch supply through conservation, stored water, reclaimed water, groundwater banking, infrastructure projects, pricing, restrictions, and long-term planning. That does not mean cities are invulnerable. They are not. But urban systems often have layers between a river cut and a household tap. A farm has fewer layers between uncertainty and action. A farmer must decide whether to plant before the season is fully known. A crop does not wait for federal negotiations to become elegant. Soil temperature changes, labor calendars fill, equipment has to be maintained, seed has to be ordered, fertilizer has to be bought, irrigation schedules have to be coordinated. The crop calendar moves forward even while the water calendar is still being argued over. That is the first shock hidden inside the headline. 77% is not only a reduction in water, it is a reduction in confidence, and confidence is part of the supply. A field can fail before it dries if the farmer cannot risk planting it. That is how a number becomes physical. It begins as a public scenario. Then it becomes a planning assumption. Then it becomes a warning inside an irrigation district. Then it becomes a conversation with a lender. Then it becomes a different crop choice. Then it becomes fewer acres. Then it becomes a pump running longer. Then it becomes groundwater replacing surface water. Then it becomes higher power costs. Then it becomes a fallowed field. By the time the public sees bare dirt, the number has already traveled through the system. This is why the headline must be handled carefully. If the number is exaggerated, the story becomes weaker. If the number is dismissed, the system risk becomes invisible. The correct position is more uncomfortable. 77% is not destiny. It is a warning about what the system may do under stress when law, hydrology, and negotiation fail to align. That is enough. The warning does not need to be inflated. It is already large. The Central Arizona Project is the place where this headline becomes concrete. The canal carries Colorado River water hundreds of miles into central and southern Arizona. It does not simply deliver water to one kind of user. It serves a region where cities, tribes, agriculture, industries, recharge projects, and long-term growth all depend on a complicated mix of supplies. But inside that mix, not every gallon has the same legal strength. That is where the public number begins to split apart. When people hear 77%, they may imagine a uniform haircut across the state. But shortage does not usually work like that. It moves according to agreements, priorities, contracts, and operating rules. Some users are shielded longer. Some users absorb reductions earlier. Some water is firmer. Some water is more exposed. The headline is 77%. The real story is who stands at the end of the line. That is why farmland becomes the flashpoint. Farmers in parts of central Arizona already know what lower priority water means. In previous shortage years, agricultural users relying on lower priority central Arizona project supplies lost large portions of their allocation before many urban users felt a comparable shock. The cuts did not land as an abstract percentage. They landed as acres not planted, irrigation plans cancelled, and a heavier turn toward groundwater. That past matters because it translates the headline. The 77% figure is not just a future possibility floating above the state. It connects to a system that has already shown where pain appears first. When Colorado River shortage reaches Arizona through the Central Arizona Project, lower priority agricultural supplies are exposed early. This does not mean farms are the only users that matter. It does not mean agriculture is innocent of water pressure. It does not mean cities have no responsibility. It means the first visible break in the shortage chain may appear in farmland because the legal and operational system places certain farm supplies near the front of the cut line. The map shows a canal. The system shows a hierarchy. And hierarchy changes the meaning of every number. Imagine two users each hearing the same regional cut. One has a high priority supply, stored reserves, alternative sources, legal protection, and the ability to spread reductions over time. The other has a lower priority supply, a seasonal crop calendar, expensive groundwater fallback, and a narrow planting window. The percentage may belong to the same river, but the impact does not belong to the same world. That is why percentages can mislead. A percentage sounds clean, it sounds mathematical, it sounds like the system can be reduced to one figure, but a river shortage is not clean, it is uneven by design, it is filtered through priority. It is delayed for some and immediate for others. It is political in one room, hydrologic in another, financial in another, and physical in the field. 77% becomes shocking because it compresses all of that into one number. But to understand the damage, the number has to be uncompressed. Start with the river. The Colorado River supplies water to tens of millions of people across the basin and supports agriculture, cities, tribes, industry, ecosystems, and power generation. The system was built around reservoirs that could store water across wet and dry years, but storage is not infinite. When Lake Powell and Lake Mead are low, the system loses the ability to absorb bad years quietly. Then move to the rulebook. The current operating guidelines expire at the end of 2026. That expiration matters because a river under stress cannot operate on hope. It needs rules for releases, shortages, reservoir protection, lower basin reductions, and interstate obligations. If the states cannot agree, federal action becomes more likely. That is where a no-deal scenario becomes more than political theater, it becomes an operating risk. Then move to Arizona. Arizona's position is unusually exposed because a large part of its Colorado River water reaches central Arizona through the Central Arizona Project, and CAP water includes priorities that do not all stand equally during shortage. Some agricultural users do not hold the same protection as higher priority users. When the system tightens, they can feel the cut sooner. Then move to the farm. A farmer does not decide in percentages. A farmer decides in acres. Plant this field or leave it out. Choose a crop that needs more water or one that can survive with less. Use surface water or pump groundwater. Take on the cost or step back. Hire a crew or cancel the work. Repair equipment or let it sit. Buy seed or wait. The headline number enters the farm as a sequence of decisions. Each decision happens before the public knows whether the worst-case number will become real. That is the strange power of a planning number. It acts before it lands. It can reduce planting confidence. It can shift investment. It can raise financing concerns. It can force districts to prepare for lower deliveries. It can make groundwater look less like a backup and more like a bridge that everyone is trying to cross at the same time. And groundwater is not a magic second river under the desert. Groundwater can keep farms alive, it can buffer a region, it can soften the first impact of a surface water shortage. But when more users lean on it, wells run longer, pumping costs rise, water tables can decline, and the future becomes more expensive. Surface water shortage does not disappear when groundwater replaces it. It changes address. That is the second shock hidden inside the headline. A surface water cut can become a groundwater problem, and a groundwater problem can become an energy problem, a land problem, a cost problem, and a governance problem. The 77% number does not explain all of that by itself. It only opens the door. Behind the door is a system where one loss creates another. Less Colorado River water means less cap supply for vulnerable users. Less cap supply means more pressure on wells or more land left unplanted. More pumping means higher costs and more stress on aquifers. Less planted land means less farm income, less local spending, and more pressure on rural communities. More uncertainty means fewer safe decisions. This is not just a water cut. This is a planting window failure. That phrase matters because it turns the number into time. If a city loses some supply, it may still be able to manage the year through multiple tools. If a farm misses the planting window, that season is gone. You cannot plant the past. You cannot irrigate a crop that was never put in. You cannot harvest a field that never entered the calendar. Water arriving late is not always water saved. Sometimes water arriving late is just a reminder of the crop that is no longer there. That is why the headline number should shock people, but not in the wrong way. The danger is not that every part of Arizona instantly loses 77% of everything. The danger is that a cut of that scale, even as a scenario, reveals how little room remains in the old operating assumptions. The old assumption was that negotiations would always stay ahead of crisis. The old assumption was that reservoirs would provide enough cushion. The old assumption was that farms could rely on seasonal deliveries often enough to keep the calendar working. The old assumption was that groundwater could serve as backup without becoming the main emergency exit. The headline number tells us those assumptions are under pressure, but it does not yet tell us the most important number. The visible number makes the headline, the hidden number writes the damage, and the hidden number is priority. The visible number is 77%, the hidden number is priority. That is where the Colorado River story becomes harder to see and much harder to explain, because priority does not look dramatic on a map. It does not appear as a dry lake bed. It does not look like cracked soil. It does not show up as a red warning banner across the desert. Priority sits inside contracts, settlement agreements, delivery schedules, legal histories, and operating rules. But in a shortage, priority becomes physical. It decides who waits. It decides who gets reduced. It decides who still receives water when the system tightens. It decides which field never enters the season. Most people imagine a water cut as a simple subtraction. There is a supply. The supply gets smaller. Everyone receives less. That is not how this system works. The Colorado River is not a single pipe with equal pressure behind every user. It is a layered legal machine. Some rights are older, some supplies are firmer, some deliveries are protected longer. Some users are standing closer to the edge before the shortage even begins. That is why the headline number is not enough. The headline tells you how large the possible cut could be. Priority tells you where the cut lands first, and those are not the same thing. In Arizona, this distinction matters more than almost anywhere else, because the Central Arizona Project was built as both a rescue system and a compromise. It brought Colorado River water into central and southern Arizona, helping cities grow, helping tribes receive settlement water, helping farms reduce groundwater pumping, and helping the state balance a future that was already too dependent on aquifers. But the water in that canal does not all stand at the same level. Some of it is connected to tribal settlements. Some of it supports municipal and industrial users. Some of it has been used for groundwater recharge. Some of it has gone to agricultural districts. Some of it belongs to lower priority pools that were always more exposed during shortage. The canal may carry one visible stream. Legally, it carries many different strengths of water. That is the hidden number. A farmer can be close to the canal and still be far from secure. A city can be physically downstream but legally more protected. A tribe can hold a settlement right that does not behave like a temporary agricultural pool. An irrigation district can have infrastructure, pumps, gates, and fields ready to receive water, but still sit behind other users when shortage rules are triggered. The map shows distance, priority shows vulnerability. This is why farmland becomes the flashpoint. Not because farms are invisible in the system, they are not. Not because agriculture uses no water, it uses a lot. Not because cities are blameless or immune, they are not. Farmland becomes the flashpoint because certain farm supplies are positioned where shortage arrives early. They are close to the first operational pain. According to Arizona State University water researchers, the Central Arizona Project Agricultural Pool lost 65% of its allocation in 2022. In 2023, that pool was cut off entirely. In 2024, it remained without water. That is the priority ladder becoming real. It was not theory, it was not a classroom diagram, it was water that did not arrive. The visible number made headlines, the hidden number wrote the damage. When the agricultural pool was reduced, the cut did not spread politely across every user in the same way. It moved through the hierarchy. Lower priority supplies absorbed the shock. Farmers who had built plans around that water had to adjust quickly. Some land was fallowed, some growers pumped more groundwater, some crops changed, some investments became harder to justify. That is how a legal ranking becomes bare soil. A priority cut does not always announce itself as disaster. Sometimes it looks like a smaller planting plan. Sometimes it looks like a field held back for one more season. Sometimes it looks like an equipment yard that stays quiet. Sometimes it looks like a grower choosing not to take a risk because the water is no longer firm enough to support the decision. That is why the hidden number is not just who has water, it is who has enough certainty to act. Certainty is a resource. A farmer needs it before the crop exists. An irrigation district needs it before it can organize deliveries. A bank needs it before it can judge risk. A worker needs it before the season begins. A processor needs it before it plans supply. A feed buyer needs it before it prices demand. When priority weakens certainty, the damage begins before the canal is empty. This is the part a simple percentage cannot show. 77% is loud, priority is quiet, but priority is the mechanism that turns a loud number into uneven reality. Imagine two Arizona water users looking at the same federal process. One holds a more secure supply. That user still worries. It may prepare conservation measures. It may search for backup supplies. It may plan rates, storage, recharge, and long-term adaptation. But it may not be forced to stop operating immediately. Another user depends on a lower priority supply. That user cannot wait for every lawsuit, negotiation, model update, and final decision. It has a season to enter. It must decide whether water will be there when the crop needs it. The same river stress reaches both users, but it does not arrive in the same form. For one, it may arrive as planning pressure. For the other, it may arrive as a closed planting window. That is the difference between volume and priority. Volume is how much water exists. Priority is how safe your share is when the volume falls. And when the river is shrinking, safety becomes the real supply. This is why the Colorado River cannot be understood only through reservoir charts. Lake Mead and Lake Powell show the physical condition. They show how much water the system has stored. They show whether there is enough cushion to keep releases comfortable. They show whether the river is carrying the burden placed on it, but they do not show who is first in line and who is last. For that, you have to look at the rules. In the Central Arizona Project system, shortage does not simply take the same percentage from every user. Lower priority water is reduced before higher priority water. Excess water and agricultural settlement supplies can be exposed before more protected municipal, industrial, and tribal supplies. That structure is not an accident. It is the result of decades of bargaining, growth, settlement, compromise, and law. But in a dry system, old bargains become present-day load. A rule written to solve one era becomes a stress point in another. A canal built to reduce groundwater dependence can send farmers back toward groundwater when surface water is cut. A settlement designed to distribute limited water can reveal how limited the water has become. A priority ladder designed for shortage can suddenly become the main story of a state economy. That is why the hidden number changes the emotional center of the video. Without priority, the story sounds like Arizona might lose a huge amount of water. With priority, the story becomes more precise. Some users are not just facing less water, they are facing less secure water. Some farms are not just facing a smaller supply, they are facing a weaker calendar. Some communities are not just facing drought, they are facing a chain reaction from surface water into groundwater, from groundwater into cost, from cost into acreage, from acreage into income, and from income into rural stability. This is not just a water cut, this is a planting window failure. The phrase matters because it names what priority does. It takes a system-wide shortage and concentrates it into time. A farm cannot spread a missed planting date across 10 years. It cannot bank a crop that was never planted. It cannot harvest a field that remained empty while the legal system continued arguing. A city planner may think in decades. A reservoir operator may think in water years. A court may think in filings. A federal agency may think in alternatives. A farmer thinks in the next irrigation. Priority decides whether that next irrigation is a promise, a maybe, or nothing. And once the answer becomes maybe, the field starts changing. The crop choice changes first. A grower may move away from a crop that needs more water, then acreage changes. A field that looked productive in the plan becomes too risky. Then capital changes. Equipment repairs, seed purchases, fertilizer orders, and labor contracts become harder to approve. Then the water source changes. If surface water is not firm, groundwater becomes the emergency exit. Then the aquifer changes. More pumping pulls the hidden reserve harder. Then the economics change. Power costs rise. Well maintenance matters more. Deeper water becomes more expensive water. Then the community changes. Less crop production means less work, less spending, less freight, less local business, and less confidence in the next season. That is the human shape of priority. It does not only decide water, it decides whether people can plan. The most dangerous part is that priority can make a shortage look smaller from far away than it feels on the ground. A statewide number may appear manageable in a report because some users remain buffered, but the users without that buffer can experience a much sharper impact. The average hides the edge. The allocation hides the calendar. The canal hides the hierarchy. And the hierarchy hides the first failure until the field is already quiet. This is why the 77% number must be treated carefully. It is not a final verdict. It is not a prediction that every user in Arizona loses the same share. It is not a reason to panic without evidence. But it is also not just political noise. It points toward the part of the system where stress becomes visible. If the basin states cannot agree, and if federal operations impose deeper cuts, Arizona's most vulnerable supplies will not be protected by geography. They will be judged by priority. The water may still be in the river for some users, while it is functionally unavailable for others. That is how a river can be present and absent at the same time, present in the reservoir, present in the canal, present in the law, absent from the field that needed it. The field does not care that the water exists somewhere else in the system. It cares whether water arrives through its gate when the soil and crop require it. That is why the hidden number writes the damage. It translates a basin-scale shortage into a local decision. It tells the irrigation district what it can promise. It tells the farmer how much risk to carry. It tells the banker whether the season looks stable. It tells the worker whether the call may come. It tells the aquifer whether it will be asked to replace what the canal no longer delivers. And once the aquifer is asked to replace the river, the story changes again, because the mechanism does not stop at priority. Priority only decides who feels the shortage first. To understand why the shortage exists and why it is becoming harder to absorb, the story has to move upward first, back through the canal, back through the dams, back through Lake Mead and Lake Powell, and finally back into the snow and heat that feed the river itself. The next clue is not on the farm. It begins above the basin. The next clue is not on the farm. It begins above the basin, before a canal opens, before an irrigation district sends an update, before a farmer decides whether a field can carry a crop. It begins in the mountains, where the Colorado River is first built out of snow. The mechanism is called reservoir, operating rules under aridification and shortage allocation. That sounds technical, but the idea is simple. When the climate delivers less usable water into the river, and the reservoirs lose the cushion they once had, the rules that move water through the system stop being background paperwork. They become the machinery of shortage. The river does not fail all at once. It tightens in stages. First, the snowpack underperforms. Then, Dry soils absorb more of the melt before it reaches streams. Then, warmer air increases evaporation and thirst across the landscape. Then, runoff becomes less efficient. Then, Lake Powell receives less inflow. Then, reservoir operators have to decide how much water can safely move downstream. Then, Lake Mead receives less protection. Then, lower basin users face tighter shortage rules. Then, Arizona's canal deliveries become more exposed. Then, the irrigation district has less to promise. Then, the farm calendar narrows. By the time a field is not planted, the shortage has already traveled through mountains, reservoirs, law, pumps, and schedules. That is the mechanism. The Colorado River is often imagined as a blue line crossing the southwest, but the real river begins as a seasonal balance sheet. Snow falls in the upper basin. It sits through winter. It melts in spring and early summer. Some of that water enters small streams. Those streams feed larger rivers. The rivers feed reservoirs. The reservoirs feed releases. The releases feed canals. The canals feed farms and cities. Every step has losses. Some water evaporates. Some water sinks into dry ground. Some water is taken up by plants. Some water is stored. Some water is released. Some water is promised before it ever arrives. In a wetter system, those losses are easier to absorb. The snowpack is stronger. The runoff is larger. The reservoirs refill more comfortably. Operating rules have more room. A bad year can be buffered by stored water from better years. But in an aridifying system, the cushion gets thinner. Aridification is not just a dry year. It is the long-term drying pressure that comes when heat, soil, moisture loss, evaporation, and runoff decline change how much water the landscape can deliver to the river. Drought can be temporary. Aridification changes the baseline. It means the same storm or the same snowpack may produce less usable river water than it once did, because the system around the river is thirstier. That is why the snow number matters, but it is not enough. A mountain can receive snow and still deliver disappointing runoff if the soil beneath it is dry, if spring heat arrives early, if evaporation increases, if the melt comes at the wrong pace, or if the landscape takes more water before the river can collect it. The snowpack is the deposit. Runoff is the cash that actually reaches the bank, and the bank is Lake Powell. Lake Powell sits upstream of the Grand Canyon behind Glen Canyon Dam. Lake Mead sits downstream behind Hoover Dam. Together, they are the great savings accounts of the Colorado River system. They were designed to store water across time, to help the river serve farms, cities, tribes, power systems, and ecosystems even when individual years were dry. But storage only works if the account is not already drawn down. According to the Bureau of Reclamation, recent system storage has been around 36% of capacity. That means the two largest reservoirs are still carrying a long-term deficit. They can still store water, they can still release water, they can still support the system, but they do not hold the same margin they once did. Margin is what keeps a hard year from becoming an immediate crisis. Margin is what allows a reservoir operator to release water downstream without risking the reservoir's own critical functions. Margin is what allows cities to plan. Margin is what allows farms to assume a delivery will exist when the crop reaches its peak demand. Margin is what allows the legal river to believe the physical river will arrive on time. When margin shrinks, every decision becomes more expensive. This is where the mechanism moves from nature into operations. If Lake Powell is low, operators cannot simply release water as if the reservoir is full. They have to consider the elevation of the lake, the ability to move water through dam outlets, the need to protect hydropower generation, the obligation to deliver water downstream, and the risk that releasing too much now could create deeper danger later. A reservoir is not just a bathtub, it is a machine with thresholds. At higher elevations, the reservoir has more flexibility. Water can move through power generating turbines. The dam can produce electricity. Releases can be managed with more operating space. At lower elevations, the system becomes constrained. Hydropower production can weaken, release options can narrow. The reservoir becomes less like a flexible savings account and more like a stressed machine that must protect its own ability to function. That is why the phrase minimum power pool matters. It is not just an engineering phrase. It marks a level below which the reservoir can lose the ability to produce hydropower through normal turbines. If the lake falls too low, the water system does not simply lose storage. It loses part of the infrastructure function that storage was built to support. This matters for Arizona, even though Lake Powell is not in Arizona's farm country, because water moves through a chain. Lake Powell helps determine releases through Glen Canyon Dam. Those releases help shape conditions downstream. Downstream conditions affect Lake Mead. Lake Mead is the reservoir that helps support lower basin deliveries. And the Central Arizona project begins by taking Colorado River water from Lake Havasu downstream of the major reservoir operations and lifting it into Arizona's interior. The farm does not have to be next to Lake Powell to depend on Lake Powell. The canal does not have to be inside the snowpack to depend on snow. The irrigation gate does not have to see Glen Canyon Dam to feel a decision made there. That is the hidden geography of the Colorado River. Distance does not protect you from dependency. The mechanism continues downstream. When Lake Mead drops, shortage rules become more important. Lower basin states, including Arizona, Nevada, and California, face operating decisions tied to reservoir elevations and federal rules. Arizona has already experienced the sharp edge of this because parts of its Central Arizona project supply carry lower priority than other uses. This is where the natural system becomes a legal system. Less runoff does not automatically decide who loses. It creates the condition in which the rulebook decides who loses. The river shrinks physically. Then the law translates that shrinkage into deliveries. That translation is not neutral. It follows priority. Higher priority supplies are protected longer. Lower priority supplies are reduced earlier. Some water is firmer. Some water is more conditional. Some users can plan with more confidence. Some users cannot. And once uncertainty enters a farm calendar, the damage begins before the field is dry. This is not just a water cut. This is a planting window failure. To see the mechanism clearly, follow 1 acre-foot. In the mountains, that acre-foot begins as snow or rain that survives the landscape's thirst and makes it into the river system. It may pass through tributaries and reservoirs. It may become part of the volume stored in Lake Powell. It may become part of the release that moves downstream through the Grand Canyon toward Lake Mead. It may support reservoir elevations that keep the system operating. It may continue downstream past Hoover Dam. It may reach the stretch of river where Arizona can divert water into the Central Arizona project. Then it enters a machine. The Central Arizona project is not a ditch. It is a long engineered system of canals, pumping plants, tunnels, pipelines, checks, gates, and control structures. It moves water across hundreds of miles of desert and lifts it across elevation. That means the water is not only a natural resource, it becomes an energy demand, a maintenance schedule, a delivery order, and a legal accounting entry. From the river, water enters the canal. From the canal, it moves toward municipal treatment plants, tribal uses, recharge facilities, industrial users, and irrigation districts. From the irrigation district, it reaches lateral canals and delivery gates. From the gate, it enters a field. From the field, it enters soil. From the soil, it enters a crop. From the crop, it enters income, food, feed, labor, and debt repayment. This is how reservoir math moves into Arizona's soil. Not as a single wave, as a chain of dependencies. Every link has a timing problem. Snow must fall in season. Runoff must arrive when reservoirs need it. Reservoir releases must match operational rules. Canal deliveries must match contracts and priorities. Irrigation schedules must match crop demand, and crop demand does not wait politely for federal negotiation. That is why agriculture is so exposed to timing failure. A city can ask residents to reduce outdoor watering. A city can invest in reuse. A city can bank water underground. A city can buy time with infrastructure, conservation, and pricing. Those tools are not unlimited, but they are tools. A crop has a narrower clock. There are windows for soil preparation, windows for planting, windows for germination, windows for irrigation, windows for fertilization, windows for harvest. Miss the window, and the system does not pause. It moves on without the crop. That is the difference between having water eventually and having water when it matters. A reservoir operator may speak in water years. A farmer lives in weeks, sometimes days. That is how the mechanism reaches the human scale. But before it reaches the person, it passes through another hidden load, groundwater. When surface water is reduced, Arizona farms may turn more heavily to groundwater. At first, that can look like resilience. A well can keep a field alive. A pump can replace a canal delivery. An aquifer can act like a backup account under the desert. But groundwater is not free time, it has its own limits. If more surface water users lean on groundwater at the same time, wells must run longer, pumping costs increase, water levels can decline. More energy may be required to lift water from deeper underground. Some wells may become less reliable. Land can sink in places where groundwater depletion becomes severe. Water quality can become harder to manage. A temporary backup can become a long-term dependency. That is how one shortage becomes another. Surface water shortage becomes groundwater pressure. Groundwater pressure becomes energy cost. Energy cost becomes farm economics. Farm economics becomes acreage decisions. Acreage decisions become rural income loss. Rural income loss becomes community stress. The mechanism is not only hydrologic, it is financial, it is legal, it is mechanical, it is human. That is why the Colorado River crisis cannot be understood as a lake level alone. Lake levels matter, but they are only the visible gauge. The real system is what happens after the gauge triggers a rule, after the rule changes a delivery, after the delivery changes a planting decision, after the planting decision changes a family balance sheet. The river enters the farm long before the water does. It enters as uncertainty. It enters as a phone call from an irrigation district. It enters as a meeting about allocations. It enters as a crop budget revised downward. It enters as a conversation about whether groundwater pumping is worth the cost. It enters as a decision not to plant. This is why the phrase planting window failure is more precise than drought alone. Drought describes a lack of water. Planting window failure describes a lack of usable certainty at the moment a farm must act. A farm can survive less water if it knows early enough, if the crop changes, if the economics work, if the well can carry the gap, if the soil and market allow adjustment. But when the system cannot promise water until too late, the farm may lose the season before the final number is known. That is the quiet violence of uncertainty. It does not break a dam. It breaks a decision. It does not flood a city. It leaves a field unentered. It does not make a dramatic sound. It removes the reason to begin, and the mechanism keeps moving. If fewer acres are planted, there may be less demand for workers during certain weeks. If less crop is harvested, there may be fewer trucking runs. If fewer trucks move, local fuel and repair businesses feel it. If farm income falls, lenders become more cautious. If lenders become more cautious, future planting becomes harder. If future planting becomes harder, more land may remain idle. If more land remains idle, the rural economy shifts. One water decision becomes many non-water consequences. This is what system risk looks like in slow motion. It does not always appear as one broken structure. It appears as synchronized narrowing. Reservoir margin narrows, legal margin narrows, canal delivery margin narrows, groundwater margin narrows, financial margin narrows, planting margin narrows. When enough margins narrow together, the system can fail without a single spectacular collapse. That is why official language matters. When reclamation speaks about low storage, weak inflow, reservoir protection, and operating rules, it is not only describing conditions at dams, it is describing the upstream shape of decisions that will eventually reach people who may never read the document. A farmer does not need to know every model run to feel the result. A worker does not need to know the exact elevation of Lake Powell to lose a season of work. A county does not need to see the federal appendix to see reduced agricultural activity. A city does not need to lose tap water immediately to inherit the next layer of risk. The mechanism begins above the basin. It moves through snow, dry soil, runoff, reservoirs, dam rules, legal priorities, canal pumps, irrigation districts, fields, wells, and bank accounts. Then it reaches a person. And once it reaches a person, it stops being a diagram. The next clue is inside a single decision, made before sunrise, when a farmer looks at a field and has to decide whether the season is still safe enough to begin. Before sunrise in central Arizona, the shortage does not look like a reservoir, it looks like a decision. A farmer stands at the edge of a field that has already been measured, leveled, financed, and imagined into the coming season. The soil is there, the equipment is there, the labor plan is there, at least on paper. The seed can be ordered, the irrigation gates can be checked, the crop budget can be revised one more time. But the question underneath all of it is no longer only what to grow. The question is whether the water is firm enough to begin. This farmer is not meant to stand for every farmer in Arizona. No single person can. Arizona agriculture is diverse. Some growers use groundwater. Some have different surface supplies. Some have stronger rights. Some are already changing crops. Some have fallowed land. Some are trying to survive on a mix of wells, district deliveries, conservation, leasing, and risk. But this one field shows the pathway. The mechanism outside the farm has already moved through snowpack, runoff, Lake Powell, Lake Mead, federal operating rules, state negotiations, priority ladders, and canal deliveries. Now it enters a smaller place. It enters a morning. It enters a phone call. It enters a budget. It enters a field that may or may not be planted. The body does not experience climate change as a graph. A farm experiences water policy as a calendar closing. That calendar begins before the public thinks the crisis has arrived. The farmer cannot wait until every agency document is final. The season does not wait for the basin states to agree. A crop cannot pause while lawyers, engineers, governors, agencies, districts, and negotiators decide the next shape of the river. A field has its own deadline. There is a day when the ground has to be prepared. There is a day when the seed decision has to be made. There is a day when fertilizer, fuel, equipment, and labor move from possibility to cost. There is a day when water uncertainty becomes too large to carry. That is how a river shortage reaches a human being, not as a dramatic wall of dust, not as a sudden empty faucet, not as a movie scene of collapse. It arrives as a narrowing set of options. The farmer may begin with the irrigation district. How much water can be expected? How reliable is the allocation? What is the schedule? What happens if federal rules change? What happens if reservoirs fall? What happens if the district has to reduce deliveries again? What happens if the surface water does not come when the crop needs it most? The answers may be careful. No one wants to overpromise. No one wants to panic. No one wants to say the season is impossible before the season starts. But careful language can still change behavior. Maybe there will be less. Maybe the timing will be difficult. Maybe groundwater will have to fill more of the gap. Maybe only part of the acreage should go in. Maybe a lower water crop makes more sense. Maybe the field should sit out. Each maybe is a cut before the cut. The farmer then takes that uncertainty into the numbers. The first number is acreage. A farm is not planted as an emotion. It is planted as a calculation. How many acres can be carried with the water available? How many acres can survive if deliveries are reduced? How much groundwater can be pumped without making the whole season too expensive? How much risk can be taken if the price of the crop falls or the cost of energy rises? The second number is crop choice. Some crops demand more water. Some can tolerate less. Some have better markets. Some have contracts. Some require equipment the farm already owns. Some fit the soil. Some fit the labor. Some fit the rotation. A crop is not chosen from a menu. It is chosen inside a web of constraints. The third number is cost. Seed costs money. Fertilizer costs money. Diesel costs money. Repairs cost money. Labor costs money. Pumping groundwater costs money. If the well has to run longer, electricity or fuel costs rise. If the water table has dropped, lifting water may take more energy. If equipment needs maintenance before the season, that cost arrives before the crop has earned $1. The fourth number is debt. Many farms operate through financing. A planting decision may depend on a loan, an operating line, or the confidence of a lender who is also reading the water news. A banker may not need to understand every detail of Colorado River law to understand risk. If the water supply is uncertain, the crop income is uncertain. If the crop income is uncertain, the loan becomes harder to justify. This is where the river enters the bank. It does not arrive as blue water. It arrives as doubt. Then it enters the house. A family that farms does not only make business decisions, it makes household decisions around the business. What can be repaired this year? What can wait? Which bills are safe? Which purchases are delayed? Whether to hire? Whether to reduce? Whether the next season can recover what this season might lose? The shortage outside becomes a conversation inside. This is not the kind of disaster that always produces a single emergency photograph. There may be no collapsed bridge, no flooded street, no burning hillside. Instead, there is a decision made quietly enough that most people never see it. A field does not get planted. That decision has a sound, but not everyone hears it. It is the sound of a tractor not running. It is the sound of a crew not called. It is the sound of a seed order reduced. It is the sound of a pump running longer somewhere else. It is the sound of a local repair shop seeing less work. It is the sound of a truck route that does not happen. It is the sound of a rural economy losing one more piece of motion. The visible event is outside. The damage begins inside the calendar. This is why farmland is such a sensitive flashpoint in the Colorado River fight. It sits at the meeting place between physical water and immediate decision. Cities can sometimes buffer shortage through a portfolio of supplies. They can draw on groundwater banking, conservation, reuse, stored water, rate structures, and long planning cycles. Those tools do not make cities invincible, but they can delay the moment when a resident feels the full shock. A farm is more exposed to the season. If water is not firm enough by the planting decision, the crop may never start. And once the crop never starts, no later policy memo can restore that harvest. A reservoir level can rise later. Negotiations can change later. A rule can be clarified later. But a missed planting window belongs to the past. You cannot harvest a correction. That is the sentence that makes this story heavy. Not because every field will disappear, not because every farmer will fail, not because Arizona will suddenly run out of water everywhere. The truth is more specific and more unsettling. The system can continue functioning while certain people absorb a much sharper impact. The canal may still carry water, cities may still operate, higher priority users may still receive supplies. The official process may still be orderly. And yet, at the edge of the system, a farmer may already be deciding that the season is too risky to enter. That is how unequal shortage works. It does not make everyone feel the same pain at the same time. It finds the exposed edge first. The exposed edge in this story is not only the farmer as a person, it is the chain behind the farmer. Consider the worker who depends on the season. That worker may not be in the federal record. They may not appear in the reservoir chart. But if acreage is reduced, the job calendar changes. Fewer acres can mean fewer hours, fewer crews, fewer harvest runs, fewer temporary jobs, fewer paychecks tied to the crop. Consider the equipment shop. A planted field wears machines. Machines need parts. Parts need suppliers. Repairs support local business. When acreage falls, equipment use can fall with it. The water cut moves from reservoir storage into a repair order that never comes. Consider the feed buyer. Arizona agriculture is tied into dairy, livestock, forage, vegetables, and regional supply chains. When water uncertainty changes crop choices or reduces acres, the effect can move into feed markets and contracts. It may not appear as one dramatic national shortage. It may appear as higher costs, longer sourcing, or another small stress added to a food system already built on thin margins. Consider the county. Agricultural land contributes to local economic activity. When fields are fallowed, the loss is not only the crop, it is the spending that would have surrounded the crop. Fuel, labor, maintenance, transportation, services, taxes, and local confidence. This is why the farm is not the end of the story. It is the door. The mechanism moves through one person and then back out into the larger system, from the atmosphere into snow, from snow into runoff, from runoff into reservoirs, from reservoirs into rules, from rules into the canal, from the canal into the irrigation district, from the irrigation district into the farmer, from the farmer into the loan, from the loan into the field, from the field into labor, food, feed, wells, power, and rural life. That pathway is what makes the shortage real. A person in Phoenix may look at the same river and see a distant policy fight. A farmer in central Arizona may see a crop calendar collapsing. Both are looking at the same system. They are just standing at different distances from the first cut. That distance matters. The public often measures water crisis by the moment a city notices. Restrictions, rate increases, dead lawns, dry taps, emergency declarations. Those are visible, urban signs. They matter, but they are not always the first signs. Sometimes the first sign is a field that never becomes visible as a loss because the crop was never planted. No harvest failure gets counted if the harvest was never attempted. No crop death gets photographed if the crop never emerged. No dramatic emergency happens if the risk was avoided by stepping back early. But the absence still has weight. An unplanted field is not nothing. It is a decision made under pressure. It is income that will not arrive. It is work that will not happen. It is groundwater that may be pumped elsewhere. It is land held in uncertainty. It is a signal that the surface water system is no longer strong enough to carry all the plans built around it. This is not just a water cut. This is a planting window failure, and that failure can become psychologically exhausting. Every season begins with questions. Farming has always involved risk. Weather risk, market risk, pest risk, equipment risk, labor risk, price risk. No farmer has ever worked inside certainty. But water uncertainty is different because it sits under every other risk. Without water, the rest of the calculation loses its foundation. A farmer can tolerate a difficult market if the crop exists. A farmer can repair equipment if the season can pay back the cost. A farmer can adjust to heat if irrigation is available. A farmer can plan around labor if acreage is known. But if water becomes uncertain at the root, every other decision becomes unstable. That is why the Colorado River shortage enters the mind before it enters the soil. It changes appetite for risk. It changes how large a season feels. It changes whether a field looks like opportunity or liability. It changes whether the future can be trusted enough to begin. And once enough people stop beginning, the system changes. The dangerous part is not only scarcity, it is hesitation repeated across a landscape. One farmer hesitates, and the effect may be private. Many farmers hesitate, and the effect becomes regional. Irrigation districts plan differently. Groundwater pumping patterns change. Local businesses brace. Workers move. Land use shifts. Political pressure rises. Urban users begin to notice that farm cuts do not stay politely outside the city. This is the human pathway of a Colorado River shortage. It does not move from river to farm in a straight line. It moves through institutions, machines, legal claims, budgets, and human nerves. It asks people to make permanent decisions with incomplete information. It turns a federal scenario into a family calculation. And then it points to the next weakness. Because the farmer is not the weak point. The farmer is where the weakness becomes visible. The weak point is smaller, colder, and more mechanical than most people think. It is the allocation ladder that decides when surface water loss becomes groundwater dependence. The farmer is not the weak point. The farmer is where the weakness becomes visible. The weak point is smaller than the river, smaller than the reservoir, smaller than the state, and smaller than the headline number. It is not the whole Colorado River system. It is not all of Arizona infrastructure. It is not even the Central Arizona project by itself. The weak point is the allocation ladder. More precisely, it is the moment when the allocation ladder turns a surface water shortage into groundwater dependence. That is the part of the system where the damage changes form. On one side, there is a canal carrying Colorado River water into central and southern Arizona. On the other side, there is a farm that still has soil, equipment, workers, debt, and a crop calendar. Between them sits a priority system that decides whether the water is firm, reduced, delayed, uncertain, or gone. The weak point is not a cracked pipe. It is a ranking. That makes it harder to see, because people are used to imagining infrastructure failure as something physical. A bridge collapses, a transformer burns, a dam overtops, a road washes out, a pipe breaks. Those failures make sense to the eye. They show the public exactly where the system gave way. But water systems can fail through rules before they fail through concrete. A canal can remain intact while the supply moving through it becomes unavailable to certain users. A pump can still work while the allocation behind the pump has weakened. A delivery gate can still open while the district has less water to send through it. A field can still be ready while the water right behind it is not strong enough to carry the season. The hardware survives, the promise weakens. That is the dangerous part. The Central Arizona project is an engineering achievement. According to the project's own public descriptions, it stretches about 336 miles and moves Colorado River water from the river system into the interior of Arizona. It serves cities, tribes, agriculture, recharge efforts, and industries across a region where much of the state's population and economy now lives. Under normal conditions, the canal can look like an answer. It reduces pressure on groundwater. It brings renewable river water into areas that once leaned far more heavily on aquifers. It gives cities a planning tool. It supports tribal settlements. It gives farms a surface water supply that can keep wells from carrying the whole burden. But in shortage, the same canal reveals a hierarchy. Water in the canal is not all equal. It may move through the same concrete channel, but it does not carry the same legal protection. Some supplies are firmer, some are more vulnerable, some are tied to settlements, some are assigned to municipal and industrial users. Some are connected to agricultural pools that were always lower on the ladder. The canal is one structure. The water inside it has different ranks. That is why the weak point is the allocation ladder itself. When the river is abundant enough, the ladder is less visible. Users may still argue, plan, and negotiate, but the physical supply can soften the tension. A wet year can cover a hard rule. A full reservoir can make priorities feel distant. A strong runoff season can hide how exposed some users really are. Low water removes that disguise. When shortages deepen, the ladder becomes the operating system. It decides who is buffered and who is exposed. It decides who has time and who does not. It decides who can still plan and who must gamble. For Central Arizona agriculture, the ladder is especially important because certain agricultural supplies delivered through the Central Arizona Project have been among the first to lose water during shortage. Arizona State University water researchers have described how the agricultural pool in the CAP system lost 65% of its allocation in 2022, then was cut off entirely in 2023 and remained without that water in 2024. That was not a hypothetical stress test. It was the weak point showing itself. A lower priority supply does not need the canal to break. It only needs the rules to say the water must go elsewhere first. That is what makes this different from a normal infrastructure story. If a canal wall collapses, repair crews can identify the break. If a pump fails, engineers can replace parts. If a gate jams, operators can fix the structure. Those are hard problems, but they are visible mechanical problems. An allocation failure is harder. It is a failure of fit between the system built for one water reality and the river that now exists. The canal was built in a world that expected Colorado River water to remain a dependable tool for reducing groundwater dependence and supporting growth. But when the river shrinks, the lowest priority users can be pushed back toward the very groundwater reliance the canal was partly meant to relieve. That is the loop. Surface water comes in to reduce groundwater pumping. Surface water gets cut. Groundwater becomes the backup. More users lean on wells. The aquifer absorbs the stress that the river can no longer carry. The weak point is the transfer of pressure from surface water to groundwater. At first, that transfer can look like resilience. A farmer with access to a well may still plant. An irrigation district may still keep some land in production. A region may avoid an immediate visible collapse. The field stays green. The crop grows. The shortage appears to have been managed. But a backup is not the same as a replacement. Groundwater is slower than a canal. It refills differently. It is harder to see. It can be pumped faster than nature restores it. It can decline underground while life above ground continues for a while as if the system is stable. That is why groundwater stress can be so deceptive. A reservoir falls in public. An aquifer falls in silence. Lake Mead and Lake Powell have visible edges. Photographs show bathtub rings. Graphs show elevations. Officials issue updates. Reporters cover the numbers. Groundwater has no single dramatic shoreline for the public to watch. The well still produces until it does not. The pump still runs until it becomes too expensive. The water table drops, but the decline may not become obvious to people outside the system until costs rise, wells deepen, land subsides, or local conflicts sharpen. That is why the fallback matters. If Arizona farms lose more Central Arizona Project water, some of that pressure can move underground. But underground is not outside the system, it is simply less visible. A field that switches from canal water to groundwater may appear saved in the short term, yet the cost of that survival can accumulate below the surface. The pump may have to lift water from deeper levels. Energy use may rise. Older wells may struggle. New wells may cost more. Water quality may vary. The land itself may sink in places where aquifers are heavily depleted. The surface shortage becomes an underground debt, and like any debt, it can grow quietly until the payment comes due. This is why the weak point is not only hydrology, it is economics. A farmer deciding whether to pump groundwater is not making a pure water decision. The farmer is making an energy decision, a maintenance decision, a debt decision, and a risk decision. How much will it cost to pump this season? How deep is the well? What happens if the pump fails during peak demand? What if the crop price falls? What if the next year is worse? What if surface water does not return soon enough? The well is not just a hole in the ground, it is a financial instrument. It can buy time. It can also increase exposure. If the cost of pumping rises, the The crop must earn more just to break even. If the crop cannot earn enough, the acreage may be reduced. If acreage is reduced, income falls. If income falls, maintenance can be delayed. If maintenance is delayed, reliability weakens. If reliability weakens, the next season starts with less margin. The weak point compounds. That is the pattern of system risk. A small component carries more load than it was meant to carry. It may not fail immediately. It may keep working. But because it keeps working under heavier pressure, other decisions begin to depend on it more. Then, when it weakens, the consequences are larger than anyone expected. Groundwater can become that component. So can the allocation ladder. The ladder decides who loses surface water first. The aquifer absorbs the attempt to keep the system moving. Together, they form the hinge between a legal shortage and a physical one. This is why the phrase weak point must be precise. The weak point is not all farmland. The weak point is not every farmer. The weak point is not simply agriculture using water. The weak point is the structural path that sends lower priority surface water users toward a less visible, more expensive, harder to govern backup supply. That path is where the system can bend, and if it bends too far, the consequences do not stay on the field. Start with the irrigation district. An irrigation district depends on predictable deliveries to organize water across farms. If its surface water allocation is reduced or removed, it cannot simply create replacement water. It must communicate less certainty to growers. It may adjust schedules. It may rely on wells where available. It may serve fewer acres. It may change how costs are spread across users. A district built around deliveries now has to manage shortage, then move to the farm. The farmer receives less certainty and has to decide whether to plant, pump, switch crops, reduce acreage, or leave land idle. That decision affects income before the season has begun. It affects workers before the harvest exists. It affects suppliers before trucks are loaded. Then move to the aquifer. If groundwater replaces missing surface water, pumping rises. If pumping rises across enough users, groundwater levels may decline more quickly. If groundwater levels decline, costs can rise again. More power is needed to lift water. Wells may need to be deepened or replaced. Smaller operators may struggle more than larger ones. Then move to the land. In some groundwater basins, long-term overdraft can contribute to land subsidence. Land subsidence is not a dramatic headline until it starts damaging roads, canals, pipelines, foundations, or drainage patterns. The land sinks because water removed from underground sediments changes their structure. Once some subsidence occurs, it can be difficult or impossible to reverse. That means the water shortage can become an infrastructure problem even without the canal breaking. The ground becomes the weak infrastructure, then move to the economy. Less planted land means less local spending. Less local spending means less support for repair shops, fuel suppliers, seed dealers, seasonal workers, truckers, processors, and small businesses. A water allocation becomes a rural income signal. A rural income signal becomes a tax-based signal. A tax-based signal becomes a public service issue. Then move to the politics. When surface water cuts hit farms first, tension grows between sectors. Farmers ask why food and rural economies are absorbing the blow. Cities ask how they can secure future supplies for residents and growth. Tribes defend rights that are legally and historically distinct. States argue about interstate obligations. Federal officials face pressure to make decisions no state wants to own completely. The weak point becomes a conflict engine. That is how a small component can pull the entire system into stress. The allocation ladder looks technical until the river drops. Then it becomes moral, economic, legal, and political. Who absorbs shortage first? Who had time to prepare? Who gets compensated? Who gets blamed? Who can afford groundwater? Who cannot? Who still has a future crop? Who has land but not water? This is why farmland is the flashpoint. A field is easy to photograph. A fallowed acre is easy to point at. A farmer facing a cut is easier to understand than a federal operating alternative. But the field is not the root weakness. It is the display screen. The weak point is the connection behind it. A lower priority surface supply enters a shortage. The canal delivery is reduced. The farm looks underground. The aquifer takes the load. The cost rises. The land and economy absorb the consequence. That is the chain. The dangerous part is that each step can appear reasonable in isolation. Cut lower priority supplies according to the rules. Use groundwater to keep farms alive. Reduce acreage to manage risk. Raise rates to cover costs. Pump deeper to meet demand. delay investment until the future is clearer. None of those decisions has to be reckless by itself, but together they can move the whole system toward a harder place. That is what a weak point does. It converts normal decisions into cumulative stress. This matters for cities too, even if the first visible cut is agricultural. A city may not lose household water immediately when agricultural supplies are reduced. But cities do not exist outside the basin economy. They rely on food systems, power systems, tax systems, transportation, tribal agreements, groundwater rules, land use decisions, and regional stability. If farms fallow more land, if groundwater dependence increases, if rural economies weaken, if legal conflicts intensify, the city inherits a more fragile state. The urban tap may still run, but the system around it becomes more strained. That is why the story cannot be reduced to city versus farm. That frame is too small. The actual story is priority versus exposure, surface water versus groundwater, short-term survival versus long-term stability, a legal ladder versus a changing river. The weak point is where those tensions meet. And the most unsettling thing is that this weak point has already been tested. Arizona has already seen Central Arizona Project agricultural water reduced sharply under shortage. It has already seen the agricultural pool lose most of its allocation, then lose it entirely. It has already seen farmland respond through fallowing, pumping, and adjustment. It has already seen how a reservoir condition becomes a field decision. That history matters because it turns the future scenario into something less abstract. This is not speculation. A version of this mechanism has already left evidence behind. And to understand how far the next shock could travel, the story has to go back to the first time Arizona watched this ladder bite hard. This is not speculation. A version of this mechanism has already left evidence behind. Arizona does not have to imagine what happens when Central Arizona Project agricultural water is cut sharply. It has already seen the first chapters. The lesson did not arrive as a future scenario. It arrived through the first federally declared shortage on the Colorado River system, through reduced deliveries, through irrigation districts, through groundwater wells, and through fields that changed before most city residents felt a direct shock. In August of 2021, the Bureau of Reclamation declared the first ever Tier 1 shortage for Lake Mead operations. That declaration shaped water deliveries for 2022. It was historic because Lake Mead had fallen low enough to trigger mandatory reductions under the operating rules then in place. The cut was not shared equally. Arizona took the largest lower basin reduction that year, about 512,000 acre-feet, roughly 18% of the state's annual Colorado River apportionment. Nevada took a much smaller cut. Mexico also took a reduction under the related agreement. California did not take a mandatory cut under that Tier 1 condition. That was the priority ladder in action. The river was short. The rules translated shortage into reductions. Arizona absorbed a large share because of where parts of its supply stood in the legal and operational hierarchy. And inside Arizona, the reductions did not spread evenly across every user. This is the first precedent that matters. The public headline was shortage. The field-level story was priority. According to Arizona State University water researchers studying Central Arizona agriculture, the Central Arizona Project agricultural pool lost 65% of its allocation in 2022. In 2023, that agricultural pool was cut off entirely. In 2024, it remained without that water. That is the mechanism leaving fingerprints, not a theory, not a warning from a distant future. Not a vague anxiety about the Southwest. A defined group of agricultural users lost most of its supply, then lost all of it, while other users in the same broader system were protected more strongly. The map did not explain that. The priority ladder did. This is why the current 77% number lands on a landscape that already remembers impact. It is not landing on a blank page. It is landing on irrigation districts that have already seen the lower priority agricultural pool disappear. It is landing on growers who have already weighed surface water loss against groundwater pumping. It is landing on communities that already know a shortage can become visible as fallowed land before it becomes visible as dry taps. History has already shown what happens when this signal is missed. But the point is not that history will repeat exactly. That would be too simple. The point is that the mechanism has already proven it can move. In 2022, the shortage was tied to existing interim guidelines and Lake Mead conditions. It had a defined trigger. It had a defined tier. It was painful, but it still operated inside a known framework. The system had rules for that moment, even if the outcome was hard. The present question is different. The current operating rules are approaching expiration at the end of 2026. The basin states have not settled on a shared path for the next era. The federal government is reviewing operating alternatives. The reservoirs remain stressed. The hydrology is less forgiving. And the no-deal scenario now being discussed would move the conflict from a familiar shortage tier into a more dangerous question. What happens when the old rulebook is no longer enough? That is the difference between the precedent and the future risk. The precedent shows the pathway. The future could test the scale. In the earlier shortage, the agricultural pool showed how low priority water can vanish from a farm calendar. The current fight asks what happens if deeper federal reductions are imposed while the basin is still divided over who should take the pain. Those are not identical events, but they rhyme through the same structure. Low reservoir, formal shortage, Arizona exposure, cap priority ladder, agricultural reduction, groundwater fallback, fallowed acreage, economic aftershock. That sequence has already occurred in smaller form. The question now is whether the next version is larger, longer, and harder to absorb. Go back to the field. Before the first Tier 1 shortage, a farmer could still talk about risk as something that might arrive. After the agricultural pool was sharply reduced, the risk was no longer abstract. It had a year, a percentage, and a delivery schedule. Then, when the pool was cut off entirely in 2023, the question changed again. It was no longer how to manage less CAP agricultural pool water, it was how to manage without it. That change matters. Losing part of a supply forces adjustment, losing all of a vulnerable supply forces redesign. A grower can sometimes stretch a partial delivery. Maybe fewer acres go in, maybe crop choice changes, maybe groundwater covers part of the gap, maybe one field is skipped, maybe another is planted. The system bends. But when an agricultural pool is cut off entirely, the surface water option disappears for that category. The farm has to find another source, pump groundwater, lease water, change production, or leave land idle. The calendar does not care that the rule has a legal explanation. It only knows whether water can be counted on. That is why the phrase planting window failure remains central. A shortage declaration does not simply remove water. It removes trust from the moment the farmer must decide. This is not just a water cut. This is a planting window failure. The precedent in central Arizona also shows why the first visible damage is not always the final damage. A fallowed field is visible. It is easy to understand. Land that was once cultivated sits bare. That image becomes the symbol. It shows the public that shortage has reached the ground. But fallowing is also a decision made to prevent another kind of failure. If the water is not secure enough, planting can be more dangerous than not planting. A crop abandoned halfway through the season can lose more money than a field left out from the beginning. A farmer may choose not to plant because the risk of planting is worse. That is a strange form of damage. The loss happens through caution. The disaster is avoided by accepting a smaller disaster early. That is how water shortage can hide its own severity. The field does not die because the farmer never gives it a chance to fail. The crop loss does not appear as ruined plants because the plants never emerge. The crisis looks quiet because the decision was made before the crisis became photogenic. Central Arizona has already seen that kind of quiet. Some acreage came out of production. Some farms relied more heavily on groundwater. Some operations adjusted. Some users survived by changing the way they used land and water. The region did not collapse overnight. Cities did not run dry. The canal did not stop existing. Life continued. That is exactly why the precedent is useful. It shows that system stress can be real without looking like total collapse. It can be partial. It can be uneven. It can be absorbed by one sector before another sector notices. It can be managed for a time by drawing down hidden reserves. It can look successful from a distance while becoming more expensive underneath. That is what happened when groundwater became the fallback. In parts of central Arizona, groundwater was not a new resource. It had long been part of the regional water story. The Central Arizona project itself was built in part to reduce dependence on groundwater by importing Colorado River water. So when surface water was cut and farms turned more heavily back toward wells, the system moved in reverse. That reverse movement is the key historical lesson. A canal built to relieve aquifer pressure cannot fully protect the aquifer if its lowest priority users lose the canal water first. the surface water shortage returns the burden underground. And once the burden moves underground, it becomes harder for the public to see. A fallowed field is visible, a dropping water table is less visible, a deeper pumping cost is less visible, a delayed well repair is less visible, a future subsidence risk is less visible. A farmer's decision not to invest is less visible, but those hidden effects may shape the next shortage more than the visible field does. This is why the precedent is not only about agriculture, it is about system memory. A system remembers stress through debt. Hydrologic debt, when reservoirs do not recover. Groundwater debt, when wells replace canals. Financial debt, when farmers carry risk through loans. Infrastructure debt, when maintenance is delayed. Political debt, when users lose trust that the next agreement will protect them. Every shortage leaves something behind. Sometimes it leaves a lower lake, sometimes it leaves an empty field, sometimes it leaves a deeper well, sometimes it leaves a changed crop pattern, sometimes it leaves a community more skeptical of the next promise. That memory is now part of Arizona's water future. The earlier shortage also showed the public something uncomfortable. Conservation and adaptation do not remove conflict. They redistribute it. When agricultural water is cut first, some people may say the system is working exactly as designed. Lower priority users take reductions before higher priority users. That is the rule. That is the legal order. That is how the ladder operates. But a system can work as designed and still produce serious consequences. A rule can be followed and still expose a weak point. A cut can be legal and still damage a community. A field can be lower priority and still support workers, food systems, local businesses, and families. That is where the precedent becomes morally complicated. The water system is not only engineering, it is not only hydrology, it is not only law. It is a way of deciding whose uncertainty becomes visible first. In the previous shortage, the answer was clear enough to measure. Central Arizona agricultural water took deep reductions. The agricultural pool lost most of its allocation, then none remained. Some tribal supplies saw much smaller reductions. Many urban systems were buffered. That does not mean any one group was wrong to protect its supply. It means the shortage revealed the structure, and the structure is now the story. The same structure sits behind the current post-2026 fight. If the 7 basin states reach agreement, the next era may still be painful, but it may be more coordinated. If they fail, the federal government may have to impose operations that leave some states and sectors exposed to sharper reductions. That is where the 77% scenario becomes important, not because it is guaranteed, because it shows the size of the cliff if coordination fails. History tells us that when the cut reaches Arizona, agriculture does not wait at the same distance as every other user. Some farms sit closer to the edge because their supplies are weaker in the priority order. If the next cut is larger, the first visible impact may again appear in fields, irrigation districts, wells, and rural balance sheets. But the next version may not stay there. The earlier shortage was a warning shot. It showed the path from reservoir elevation to cap reduction to agricultural loss to groundwater pressure. The next question is whether repeated use of that path begins changing the whole state pattern. How much land can be fallowed before rural economies change? How much groundwater can replace surface water before the backup becomes the problem? How many seasons can farmers enter with weakened certainty before investment retreats? How much urban growth can continue while the regional water system becomes more contested? How many legal promises can fit inside a river that is physically smaller than the paper built around it? Those questions are larger than the first shortage. But the first shortage gave them evidence. It proved that the ladder moves. It proved that lower priority water can disappear. It proved that surface water loss can push users underground. It proved that the damage begins before the public sees a dramatic failure. It proved that the old reservoir cushion is no longer enough to hide the hierarchy. That is why the precedent matters, not as a prophecy, as a trace. The system has already shown the route the next shortage may take, from Lake Mead elevation into a federal shortage declaration, from federal declaration into Arizona reductions, from Arizona reductions into cap priorities, from cap priorities into agricultural pools, from agricultural pools into farm decisions, from farm decisions into groundwater, acreage, labor, and local economies. The current fight is not asking whether that route exists. It is asking how far that route could extend if the next operating era begins with low reservoirs, unresolved politics, and a river that no longer behaves like the old calendar. This is the bridge from precedent to pattern. A single shortage is an event. Repeated shortage becomes a system. And when the same weak point is used again and again, the story expands beyond farmland into the whole economy of water. A single shortage is an event. Repeated shortage becomes a system. That is the turn Arizona is now facing. The story no longer fits inside one dry year, one reservoir graph, one farm district, one federal proposal, or one headline number. The pattern is larger than that. It is the pattern of a state trying to run a modern economy on a river system whose old assumptions are no longer holding with the same force. This is not only a Colorado River dispute, it is a calendar failure. It is an infrastructure test. It is a groundwater warning. It is a rural economy signal. It is a question about whether the Southwest can keep using yesterday's planning margins for tomorrow's water. That is why farmland is the flashpoint, but not the whole fire. Farmland shows the shortage first because the farm calendar has less room to hide uncertainty. But once the shortage appears there, it does not stay there. It moves outward through wells, energy costs, labor markets, food and feed systems, local tax bases, tribal water discussions, municipal planning, industrial growth, housing policy, and state politics. The field is the first screen. The state is the system behind it, according to the Bureau of Reclamation. Agricultural uses depend on about 70% of Colorado River water. At the same time, tens of millions of people rely on the river for at least part of their municipal supply. That combination is the central tension. The river is not serving one purpose. It is serving many purposes that were allowed to grow around the expectation that stored water, legal agreements, and engineering could keep the system balanced. For a long time, that expectation was powerful. The reservoirs were supposed to provide cushion. The canals were supposed to move water where growth demanded it. The laws were supposed to divide a shared river. Groundwater was supposed to act as backup, not the first emergency exit. Cities were supposed to grow while improving efficiency. Farms were supposed to adjust, but not lose the ability to plan entire seasons. Each piece made sense inside its own era, but the river is now testing whether those pieces still fit together. The abnormal pattern is not just that the Southwest is dry. The abnormal pattern is that multiple margins are narrowing at once. Reservoir margin is narrower because Lake Powell and Lake Mead are still carrying long-term stress. Hydrologic margin is narrower because heat, dry soils, weak runoff, and aridification can reduce how much mountain snow becomes usable river water. Legal margin is narrower because the current operating rules are nearing expiration and the next rulebook has not yet become a settled, shared agreement. Infrastructure margin is narrower because canals, pumps, reservoirs, power systems, and groundwater wells are being asked to carry more uncertainty. Economic margin is narrower because farmers, cities, tribes, industries, and households are all planning in a system where water security is becoming more expensive. When one margin narrows, a system can adapt. When many margins narrow together, adaptation becomes a race. This is not just a water cut, this is a planting window failure. But by this stage, that phrase means more than one farm. It means the calendar itself is becoming less reliable as a planning tool. A farmer cannot count on the old delivery assumptions. A city cannot count on the old reservoir cushion. A tribe cannot count on negotiations to move quickly enough. A manufacturer cannot count on growth being separated from water politics. A rural county cannot count on agricultural activity remaining steady if surface water becomes less secure. The old calendar said that snow built the river in winter and spring, reservoirs stored the result, rules moved the water, and users planned around deliveries. The new calendar is less cooperative. Snow may fall, but runoff may disappoint. Reservoirs may store water, but not enough to restore comfort. Rules may exist, but they may be rewritten under pressure. Water may be allocated, but not with enough certainty for the users at the edge. The river may still flow, but the planning confidence around it weakens. That is what a new baseline looks like. Not a sudden end, a different starting point. In the old baseline, shortage was the exception that reservoirs helped absorb. In the new baseline, shortage becomes a recurring operating condition. In the old baseline, groundwater could be treated as backup. In the new baseline, groundwater becomes the place where surface water stress is transferred. In the old baseline, a bad year could be followed by recovery. In the new baseline, recovery may be slower, weaker, or interrupted by the next hot dry sequence. In the old baseline, the legal river and the physical river could be treated as if they were close enough. In the new baseline, the gap between them becomes harder to ignore. That gap is now the system pattern. The legal river is the river written into allocations, contracts, settlements, compacts, and operating agreements. The physical river is the water that actually arrives after snowpack, heat, soil moisture, evaporation, reservoir storage, and releases do their work. For decades, the system survived because reservoirs helped bridge the difference. They turned time into water. They allowed the legal river to behave as if the physical river would return to form often enough. But when reservoirs are low, the bridge weakens. Then every sector begins protecting itself. Cities look for conservation, reuse, storage, and future supplies. Tribes defend rights and negotiate long-delayed access, infrastructure, and leasing opportunities. Farmers reduce acreage, shift crops, pump groundwater, or leave land idle. Industries ask whether long-term water reliability can support expansion. State officials look for agreements that reduce political damage. Federal officials prepare rules no one fully likes. That is not a single crisis. It is a system trying to ration risk. The problem is that risk does not spread evenly. A higher priority user may experience the crisis as a planning problem. A lower priority farmer may experience it as a season lost. A city may experience it as pressure to conserve. A rural worker may experience it as fewer hours. A well owner may experience it as deeper pumping. A power manager may experience it as a reservoir elevation concern. A taxpayer may experience it later through infrastructure costs. The same river shortage wears different masks depending on where a person stands. That is why the farm is politically explosive. If farms lose water first, some urban viewers may think the problem is contained. They may think the shortage has been absorbed by a sector that uses large volumes, but that reaction misses the chain. Agriculture is not separate from the state. It is tied to land, labor, food, feed, water rights, groundwater, rural economies, and political legitimacy. When farmland is fallowed, the public may see an environmental correction or a necessary sacrifice. But the system sees something more complicated. It sees surface water failing to carry a planned economy. It sees groundwater being asked to absorb the difference. It sees rural communities absorbing losses before urban comfort changes. It sees one sector becoming the shock absorber for a river that supports many sectors. A shock absorber can protect the vehicle for a while, but shock absorbers wear out. If agriculture absorbs repeated cuts, the visible damage may be fewer acres. The hidden damage may be reduced investment, weaker rural economies, more groundwater stress, and deeper mistrust among water users. At some point, the question becomes not only how much water farms should use, but what happens to the entire regional system when farms are repeatedly used as the pressure release valve. That is the state risk. Arizona's water portfolio is not one source. The Arizona Department of Water Resources has described a supply mix that includes Colorado River water, groundwater, in-state surface water, and reclaimed water. Recent reporting summarized that Colorado River water makes up about 36% of the state's supply, while groundwater makes up about 41%, with in-state rivers and reclaimed water making up the rest. Those numbers reveal the next pattern. If Colorado River water weakens, groundwater becomes more tempting, but groundwater is already a major part of the state's supply, so the backup is not empty, it is already in use. That means a surface water cut does not simply send users to an untouched reserve, it sends more pressure into a system that already carries a large load. This is the classic failure pattern of complex infrastructure. The backup works, so everyone leans on it. Because everyone leans on it, the backup becomes less safe. Then the next crisis begins with the backup already stressed. The weak point is not only the shortage, the weak point is what the shortage forces the system to use next. In Arizona, that means wells, pumps, aquifers, recharge systems, legal boundaries, groundwater management areas, rural basins, energy costs, and land use decisions. Groundwater is local in a way the Colorado River is not. A Colorado River shortage is regional and interstate. Groundwater stress can be intensely local. One basin can be under more pressure than another. One farm can have a deeper well than its neighbor. One county can feel the economic impact more sharply than another. One rural area can face choices that Phoenix does not immediately see. That makes the risk harder to govern. A river has gauges, a reservoir has elevation, a canal has deliveries. Groundwater has many hidden ledgers, and hidden ledgers can delay action. That delay is part of the pattern. Systems built around old assumptions often do not fail because no one saw the danger. They fail because every actor has a reason to wait. Wait for the next snowpack. Wait for the next federal rule. Wait for the next state negotiation. Wait for the next wet year. Wait for the next funding package. Wait for the next technology. Wait for the next agreement. Waiting can be rational, but waiting repeated across a shrinking margin becomes exposure. That is what the Colorado River is now showing. The river is not only asking for conservation, it is asking whether the governance system can move at the speed of the hydrologic system. Snowpack, heat, runoff, and reservoir levels move on physical time. Legal agreements move on political time. Crops move on seasonal time. Infrastructure moves on construction time. Aquifers move on deep time. Those clocks do not match. When the river was more forgiving, the mismatch was easier to survive. When the river becomes less forgiving, the clock mismatch becomes a risk of its own. A farmer cannot wait for a court. A reservoir cannot wait for an election. An aquifer cannot recover on a budget cycle. A city cannot redesign growth overnight. A tribe cannot build water infrastructure out of a paper, right alone. A power system cannot ignore reservoir elevation because negotiations are difficult. This is the system expansion. A water cut becomes a timing conflict across institutions. That timing conflict is already visible in the post-2026 process. The current rules expire at the end of 2026. Federal review is moving. States are negotiating. Public comments have entered the record. Water users are watching. But the river is not waiting for consensus. Each water year adds new information, and not all of it is comforting. If the next rules are too weak, reservoirs may remain vulnerable. If the next rules are too harsh, some users may face severe economic damage. If the states cannot agree, federal action may create new political and legal conflict. If the system relies too much on temporary conservation, it may not solve the structural imbalance. If the system relies too much on groundwater fallback, the hidden debt grows. There is no painless version of this. That is why the old city versus farm frame is inadequate. Cities need water security. Farms need water security. Tribes need water security. Ecosystems need water. Power systems need reservoir function. Rural economies need viable land use. The question is not which user matters. The question is what kind of system can remain stable when the river no longer supports every old promise in the old way. That is the uncomfortable center. The river is not only short of water, it is short of slack. Slack is the spare room that lets systems absorb shocks, extra reservoir storage, flexible supplies, strong aquifers, affordable energy. Trust between states, clear rules, time before a crop decision, political room to compromise, financial space for farmers, public patience for conservation, engineering capacity to adapt. The Colorado River system has less slack than it used to. When slack disappears, normal events become harder. A dry winter matters more. A hot spring matters more. A delayed agreement matters more. A court fight matters more. A canal allocation matters more. A well failure matters more. A crop decision matters more. That is what makes the future echo dangerous. Not that every year will be the worst year. Not that every farm disappears. Not that every city runs dry. The danger is that the system starts each year with less room to absorb the next hit. A future dry year would not land on the old Colorado River system. It would land on a system already reorganized by previous shortages, groundwater pumping, political conflict, reduced confidence, and tighter reservoirs. Each shock leaves a residue. The next shock lands on that residue. That is how baseline changes. At first, an emergency becomes a temporary measure, then temporary measures repeat, then repetition becomes the operating model, then the operating model becomes normal, then people forget that normal used to mean more margin. The Colorado River is at risk of entering that cycle. Arizona farmland is the flashpoint because it shows the transition early. The fallowed field is not just a local consequence. It is a symbol of a system moving from abundance management to shortage management, from predictable delivery to conditional delivery, from surface water relief to groundwater dependence, from annual planning to seasonal uncertainty. This is not only drought, it is a recovery failure. The system can survive a dry year if it recovers. The system can survive a cut if the next years restore margin. The system can survive uncertainty if certainty returns before decisions collapse. But if recovery windows shrink, then every future shock arrives before the system has fully healed from the last one. That is the future echo. The next snowpack will matter. The next reservoir forecast will matter. The next federal operating rule will matter. The next state agreement will matter. The next farm season will matter. But the deeper question is whether those next events land on a system with enough recovery left. The evidence is strong enough to make the risk visible, but it is not strong enough to justify exaggeration. And before this story ends, the line between evidence and fear has to be drawn clearly. That line matters because the Colorado River does not need to be exaggerated to be serious. The evidence is already strong enough. Federal officials are rewriting the operating rules for the river after 2026. Lake Powell and Lake Mead remain under long-term stress. The basin states have not yet produced a final shared path that removes the risk of federal action. Arizona is more exposed than many people realize because some central Arizona project supplies sit lower in the priority system. Agriculture has already absorbed sharp reductions in previous shortage years, and groundwater has already become part of the fallback when surface water becomes less secure. Those facts are enough. The warning does not need exaggeration. The evidence is already enough. So this is the boundary. It is true that Arizona could face severe cuts under a no-deal federal scenario described in recent reporting. It is not true that every Arizona water user has already lost 77% of their Colorado River supply. It is true that the Central Arizona project is exposed to shortage because of priority. It is not true that the canal itself has failed. It is true that some agricultural users have already seen major reductions and even complete loss of certain cap agricultural pool supplies. It is not true that all farming in Arizona is the same, or that every farm faces the same water risk. It is true that groundwater can help buffer a surface water cut. It is not true that groundwater is an unlimited replacement river hidden under the desert. It is true that climate change and aridification are changing the behavior of the Colorado River system by increasing heat, dryness, evaporation pressure, and runoff stress. It is not honest to blame every legal decision, every farm choice, every city plan, and every reservoir movement on one simple cause. It is true that agriculture uses a large share of Colorado River water. It is not true that agriculture is only a villain in this story. It is true that cities may be buffered longer than some lower priority farm supplies. It is not true that cities are outside the problem. It is true that tribes hold essential rights, histories, and claims in the basin. It is not true that tribal water can be treated as a side issue. It is true that the river system is under pressure. It is not true that collapse is the only possible future. That distinction is the difference between analysis and fear. Fear wants one culprit. The river does not give us one. Fear wants one number. The system gives us a hierarchy. Fear wants one moment when everything breaks. The evidence shows something more complicated. A formal review, a low storage condition, a weak inflow forecast, a legal deadline, a state disagreement, a canal priority ladder, a farm calendar, a groundwater fallback. A notchy absorbing impact before the whole public understands the signal. That is not a simple disaster movie. It is an operating system under stress, and that is why the story keeps returning to the same sentence. This is not just a water cut. This is a planting window failure. At the beginning, the number 77% sounded like the main story. It was large enough to dominate everything around it. It seemed to answer the question before the question was even asked. How bad could it get? 77%. But now the number looks different. It is not only a measurement of possible loss, it is a door into the structure behind the loss. It forces the viewer to ask where the cut lands, who stands behind whom, what water is firm, what water is conditional, which users can wait, which users cannot, and which decisions have to be made before the final rule is written. The number opened the story. Priority explained the damage. The mechanism showed the pathway. The farmer made it human. The allocation ladder revealed the weak point. The precedent proved the route had already been used. And the system pattern showed why this cannot be reduced to one dry year. That is the shape of the evidence. Now return to the opening signal. A federal agency moves the next Colorado River operating rules through formal review. The old guidelines are nearing expiration. The reservoirs are not full. The states remain divided. Recent reporting warns that Arizona could face cuts as high as 77% under a no-deal federal scenario. And somewhere far from the hearing room, a farmer looks at a field and has to decide whether the season is safe enough to begin. The official signal is paperwork. The physical signal is low water. The economic signal is hesitation. The human signal is a field that may not be planted. That is how this kind of crisis announces itself. Not with one sound. With several quiet decisions pointing in the same direction, the Colorado River system was built around assumptions that made sense in an earlier world. Snow would accumulate. Runoff would come. Reservoirs would refill often enough. Growth could be supported by storage, canals, groundwater, and law. Shortage could be managed through temporary rules and emergency agreements. The past would not repeat perfectly, but it would remain close enough to guide the future. That confidence is what is now being tested. The river still exists. The canals still exist. The farms still exist. The cities still exist. The law still exists. But the fit between them is weaker than it used to be. That is the central warning. Not that every promise disappears tomorrow. Not that Arizona becomes unlivable overnight. Not that every farm fails. Not that every city loses water at once. The warning is that the system was built with more slack than it now has. Reservoir slack. Legal slack, groundwater slack, financial slack, seasonal slack, political slack. And when slack disappears, the same event produces more damage than it once did. A dry year becomes harder. A delayed agreement becomes harder. A weak snowpack becomes harder. A late decision becomes harder. A lower priority supply becomes harder. A planting window becomes harder. The future will not be decided only by the peak cut. It will be decided by whether the system still has time to recover before the next load arrives. That is the phrase to hold on to. Time to recover. A reservoir needs time to recover after weak inflow. An aquifer needs time to recover after pumping. A farm needs time to recover after a fallowed season. A rural economy needs time to recover after reduced activity. A legal system needs time to recover after conflict. Public trust needs time to recover after broken expectations. If the next shock arrives before recovery is complete, the system does not restart from the old baseline. It starts from a lower one. That is how a future changes without a single dramatic breaking point. The first shortage becomes the memory of the second. The second shortage becomes the starting point of the third. A temporary cut becomes a planning assumption. A backup well becomes a regular tool. A fallowed field becomes a normal option. A difficult season becomes the new calendar. That is the future echo. And it is not inevitable. There are choices still ahead. The basin states can reach stronger agreements. Federal rules can protect critical reservoir functions while sharing reductions more clearly. Cities can continue reducing demand and investing in reuse and storage. Tribes can receive infrastructure and authority that match their rights. Farms can adapt with support instead of being left as the silent shock absorber. Groundwater can be governed before it becomes the next emergency. The public can stop treating water as invisible until the moment it fails. But none of those choices works if the evidence is softened into comfort or inflated into panic. Comfort says the canal still runs, so the system is fine. Panic says the system is doomed, so planning is useless. Both are wrong. The harder truth is that the system is still functioning, but it is functioning under tighter margins. That means decisions still matter. It also means delays matter more than before. A river under stress is not only a natural problem, it is a timing problem. Can the rules move before the reservoirs fall farther? Can conservation move before emergency cuts become deeper? Can groundwater governance move before the backup is overdrawn? Can farm support move before entire planting decisions disappear? Can public understanding move before the next headline number arrives? That is where the story ends, not in despair, but in precision. The Colorado River crisis is not a distant abstraction, it is a chain, from snow into runoff, from runoff into reservoirs, from reservoirs into operating rules, from rules into the Central Arizona Project, from the canal into priority, from priority into farms, from farms into wells, from wells into energy, from energy into cost, from cost into acreage, from acreage into rural life, from rural life back into the politics of a state still trying to grow. Once you see the chain, the headline changes. 77% is no longer just a number, it is a stress test. It asks whether Arizona can protect cities without erasing farmland. It asks whether farms can adapt without draining the underground reserve. It asks whether tribes can be treated as central governments in the basin rather than footnotes. It asks whether federal and state leaders can write rules for the river that exists now, not the river people wish still existed. It asks whether the Southwest can move from emergency reaction to structural honesty. That is the question the official signal placed on the table. Not whether water matters, everyone knows that. The question is whether the system can still decide clearly before the calendar makes the decision for it. A field does not wait for certainty forever. A reservoir does not wait for politics. An aquifer does not wait for accounting. A canal does not change the priority of the water it carries. A farmer does not get the season back once the planting window closes. That is why farmland is the flashpoint. It is not the whole story. It is where the hidden story becomes visible first. The event will move through hearings, models, negotiations, agency records, state statements, and perhaps courtrooms. The exact shape of the final rule may change. The 77% scenario may not become the final outcome. Better agreements may reduce the cliff. Future snow years may offer temporary relief. Adaptation may soften part of the blow. But the thing revealed by this moment will remain. A river system built around old assumptions is being tested by a world no longer following the old calendar. The opening signal looked like policy. It was really a warning about time. How much time remains in the reservoirs? How much time remains in the negotiations? How much time remains in the aquifers? How much time remains in the farm calendar? How much time remains before backup systems become primary systems? How much time remains before the next load arrives? That is the final echo. The future of Arizona water will not be decided only at the moment of the largest cut. It will be decided in the quieter moments before that, when officials choose rules, when districts choose allocations, when farmers choose acres, when cities choose conservation, when tribes choose strategy, when groundwater is either protected or spent, and when the public decides whether a fallowed field is someone else's problem or the first visible sign of a system running out of slack. The river will still move. The canal will still trace its line across the desert. The fields will still wait for water. The question is whether the system can still deliver certainty in time for the season to begin.